Good morning. Delighted to introduce a wonderful discussion today with a longtime colleague in the Legal Academy, Jonathan Barnett, in which we'll be discussing his research into how patents promote economic development with evidence from the patent tigers. The current pandemic, of course, has brought to the forefront in the policy debates and among the public at large fundamental questions about the role of patents in promoting and encouraging not just medical innovation, but innovation and economic development and activities more generally. And conventional wisdom usually maintains that patents interfere with and block economic development by locking up technologies, by restricting access, and thus limiting industrial output and raising prices for consumers. Jonathan has engaged in a really fascinating study of some developing economies, which has brought to the forefront some important data that challenges this conventional wisdom. And so I'm very happy that he has taken some time out of his schedule to speak with us about this important study that he is engaged in. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So, so for our audience who may not be aware of him, Jonathan Barnett is the Torrey H. Webb Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Gould School of Law, and he is the director of the law school's Media, Entertainment, and Technology Law program. Now, he has been very active in the academy and is a prolific publisher of economic studies and research on intellectual property and its role in innovation and its role in promoting creative output as well. For those who are interested in knowing more about him and seeing all of his accolades and achievements that he has accrued over his long and distinguished career, I highly recommend embracing the online environment in which you are experiencing this now and just Googling him and reading up on his background. I would like us to spend more time today actually talking about his actual study and the implications of his study for patent policy and innovation policy more generally. So without much further ado, Jonathan, how about you describe your study of this category of developing countries that you call patent tigers and what you found?
All right. Well, thank you, Adam, and thank you to the Hudson Institute for the opportunity to bring this research to a broader audience. And what I try to do in this study is to address exactly the questions you're talking about, that people in policy circles, academic circles are talking about, which is what exactly, if any, is the connection between patents and intellectual property rights on the one hand, and economic development and innovation on the other. And what this study does, being an empirical study, is just to track down the numbers, do the hard number crunching, and just let the numbers tell the story. And by letting the numbers tell the story, there's some interesting things that come out of the study that I think run contrary and challenge some of the conventional wisdom that is cast doubt on whether there really is a relationship between patents on the one hand and economic development innovation on the other. There's two main findings in this study, and I'd love to jump into the details of it after I lay those out. The first one is that the USPTO, since 1965, which is where this study starts, all the way up to the present, has become a world patent office. What do I mean by that? I mean that by now, a majority of the inventors applying and receiving patents at the USPTO are non-US inventors. This is a great thing both for the US and for the world generally, because it's suggesting that innovation is becoming globalized around the world. In fact, it suggests that a lot of the so-called patent explosion that has attracted criticism and concern is merely reflecting the fact that more of the world, much more of the world, is participating in the innovation ecosystem, and that really can only be a good thing. The second thing I found more recently, starting in the 90s and really accelerating in the 2000s up through the present, are three countries that I call the patent tigers: South Korea, Taiwan, and Israel. What is special about these countries? When we take their patenting numbers, either in absolute numbers, per capita, per GDP, these countries are off the charts. High patenting numbers. And what that suggests again is because these countries roughly at the same time were moving up the ladder of economic development, it suggests that there is some reason to believe that there is a strong relationship between active participation in the patent system, in this case, the US patent system, and economic development and innovation. And so I'll just leave it at that at this stage in our discussion, and then we can get into the details in the remainder of our time.
All right, great. Now, as a preliminary matter, and something that I think would present itself as an initial question to anyone who is aware a little bit about intellectual property laws, that intellectual property laws, both historically and today, are enforced entirely domestically. And so the US patent system and the patents that are issued by the USPTO, the US Patent and Trademark Office, of course, are confined only to the United States as a legal matter. So how would this then affect innovation outside the United States? And even if it does, why, that leads up to a follow-up question, which is why is that good for the US consumer?
All right, so let me take each of those in turn. Absolutely, the U.S. patent system, like all patent systems around the world, are territorial. But the US patent system almost uniquely has extraterritorial impact economically of a serious magnitude. And there's two reasons for that. One is economic. The US remains the world's most attractive consumer market. So if you've got a great new innovation, a great new technology, odds are you're going to be wanting to sell it in the US. And so a US patent is of great value to you. What about goods that are produced outside the US and then brought into the US? Well, if they are made using a process where they're infringing upon a product or a process patent that's been issued by the USPTO, that patent owner can go to the International Trade Commission, which despite its name is a US administrative agency, and secure an exclusion order to block the importation of those goods at customs. And so that's why it has extraterritorial impact. Now, the second question, why is this good for the US consumer? Well, the US consumers always benefit by having maximal product variety, maximal flow and speed of innovation, and all at the lowest cost possible. And so what we want as a US citizens, and I would argue as global citizens as well, is that we want a property rights system in the global innovation ecosystem that incentivizes that type of market process and market-based innovation to work. And that's good for everyone in the world, and that's good for the US consumer as well.
Fascinating. So now your example in your paper is, of course, the excuse me, the apologize. Stop. We'll just take a break, and I'll start that question over again. Is the semiconductor market, right? Yeah. So, all right. So, so fascinating. Now, your example in your paper is the U.S. semiconductor market, and you argue that patents play a very important role in supporting global supply chains in the electronics markets generally. Now, for people who've been following the patent policy debates, this seems counterintuitive. People usually think of patents as increasing costs, increasing litigation risk, blockading development. So, how actually have patents facilitated a global supply chain in this context?
Yeah, absolutely. This insight, which I think is both true theoretically and demonstrated empirically in this paper, is counterintuitive. The insight goes back all the way to a famous paper by a famous economist named Kenneth Arrow at Stanford University in 1962. And he pointed out something that has since become known as Arrow's paradox. And in plain English, the problem, what he pointed out is that transacting over informational goods is very different from transacting over a car, a house, or a latte at Starbucks. And the reason is that information is very easy to replicate, and even when it's replicated, difficult to detect that that's been done. Why does that cause a problem in transactions? Well, in order for me to reveal my innovation to you, I need to tell you a lot about it. If you're sophisticated and well-resourced, well, setting aside reputational constraints, you may run away with my innovation and use it without any compensation being paid to me. This is where IP rights and patent rights come into the picture, and counterintuitively, they lower transaction costs. Why is that the case? Because if my idea is enveloped inside a property right, I can put that down on the proverbial negotiating table. I can tell you everything about that innovation, because as a matter of law, I know that I am protected against it being used by someone else without negotiated compensation. This leads to another counterintuitive insight. Because patents make it easier to transact over informational assets, they actually lower entry barriers into markets. What is the logic behind this? Let's imagine that I have a component of a larger technology system, which I've come up and it's going to make that system work a lot better. But I have neither the capital nor the technical resources to put together a whole end-to-end solution like IBM used to put together. But I do have this component. With that component protected by a patent, I can go to the IBMs and the Intels and the Apples of the world, and I can negotiate with them for a fair market valuation. Without that patent protection, I am exposed to my innovation being taken, being copied, being imitated without any compensation. And by a domino effect, I have no incentive to enter into that market at all. And that's where we get these two pair of counterintuitive insights. Patents, at least in certain circumstances, reduce transaction costs. And because they reduce transaction costs, they reduce entry barriers. And we actually see, this is not just theory, we actually see evidence of this in the supply chains in the semiconductor market.
Now, this is another great example, I think, where you are raising some points that challenge conventional wisdom. Your example of, the person having a patent on a component and then going to IBM, which thus implies that you have different market actors providing inputs in the entire supply chain, as opposed to a fully integrated company, top to bottom, who is both creating all of the inputs, putting them together, manufacturing and distributing and retailing at the end of the day. So why would we care about whether our smartphones or other electronics devices, of which the semiconductor industry is part of, right? Why would we care whether these are all designed, produced, and assembled by one company or by tens of companies? Is there any impact in between those two types of models?
There is a huge impact. And let me start with just a simple illustration and then get into the details. Let's just compare for a moment, just in rough terms, the computing power and communications power per dollar of an Apple IIc, let's say in the early 1980s, and what you, Adam, probably have in the vest pocket of your sports jacket right now, whether you have a Samsung or an Apple smartphone, those are orders of magnitude differences for a price that is significantly less than the price that was paid for that Apple IIc with the little green screen back in the early 1980s. Now, part of that story is technology, but the other part of that story goes all the way back to Adam Smith's pin factory and the division of labor. Patents lower transaction costs over transacting over information. And because of that, they lower entry barriers into the supply chain. Now, there's a third step that I had to mention, because the next thing that happens is that when you can enter into the supply chain at the component level instead of the end-to-end level, what happens is the supply chain starts to break apart. Why does it do that? It does that because of market forces. Every single buyer of an input into the smartphone, the laptop, going backwards, the DVD player is forced by competition to find the best and the cheapest supplier of that component. The patent system enables component suppliers to enter into the market at the component level. The supply chain breaks apart. This is not just mere aesthetics. This is not just because it's a great, we love small firms, love individual inventors, which we may, right? But it's good from the perspective of the consumer because the market is driven to find the cheapest supplier, the best supplier of every single component. And while it is also a technology story, the reason why you have orders of magnitude greater computing power per dollar in your vest pocket or your purse and so forth partly has to do with that supply chain disintegration. That can only happen when you have secure property rights that enables informational assets to be exchanged among parties that are otherwise in an adverse competitive position. And if we go on, and I could love to give you an example from the semiconductor market of how that actually transpired.
Oh, excellent. Well, let's hold that for a moment because I want to eventually get to the actual patent tigers examples. But maybe you can illustrate that through the semiconductor industry, since your patent tigers are examples in that industry. So, but I do want to ask a more general question before we jump into some of those details, which is something also that a lot of economists and others are well aware of, which is you've identified, of course, that Korea, Taiwan, and Israel, your patent tigers, have increased their level of patenting. Now, a high level of patenting has long been recognized as not necessarily an indicator of innovation, although it could potentially be so. So how do we determine whether patenting is really a good indicator of innovation in the case of a particular jurisdiction or not?
All right. So there's two things to say about that. First, at the most general level, I think it is somewhat underappreciated that when we look at countries that are strong in innovation, we almost always find that they have strong levels of patenting. Okay. But we should remain skeptical, and I take a very skeptical view of the data in this paper. And where I see high patenting levels by any particular country, and I focus on these three in particular, I use different empirical tools to get at this question, is that really reflective of innovation, right? Or the alternative hypothesis, it's reflective of opportunistic behavior, of strategic behavior. And to get at this question where we can't ever have 100% confidence, I look at two pieces of data, right? The first one has to do with what I'll call the inputs. What's being invested in the innovation ecosystem in Taiwan? Are they investing a lot in R&D? Are they investing a lot in STEM education? And the second thing that I look at are the outputs. When we look at the quality of the patents, we can measure quality of patents imperfectly, but with some insight into such things as when inventors from a particular country apply for a patent, how successful are they compared to inventors from other countries, from US inventors? And the other thing we can look at, which is well known, is when they get a patent, how often is it cited? Since it's natural to think if you have a more valuable patent, you've made a bigger contribution, others are going to have to cite you. And while we can't ever be completely confident, when I look at almost every one of these measures, whether we look at the inputs going into the innovation ecosystem in the patent tiger countries, whether we look at the outputs, they are scoring at the top of the charts, not just on patenting, but on these other innovation metrics. So for sure, we have to grant the point that some portion of the patenting activity we're seeing is not reflective innovation, it's strategic. But when you see an entire ecosystem that is scoring an A or A plus, both in patenting and on innovation metrics, I think the best explanation of the data is that at least in the case of these three countries, high patenting levels are also indicative of high levels of innovative contributions to the global innovation economy.
All right, so let's continue to wear our skeptical hat for a moment and continue to press you on that claim and the data that underlies it. So you've identified these three countries, Korea, Taiwan, and Israel, your patent tigers, how they've
Yeah.
outperformed patenting at the USPTO and moved up the innovation ladder. So how do we know these aren't just one-off cases? As opposed to the cases that you can generalize from?
I have two reasons to think that these are not one-off cases at all. And in fact, we can learn from these cases and we can say things more generally about innovation economics, the economics of the patent system. Okay? The first one is that the Patent Tigers Club should actually be expanded to include a number of smaller countries located in Europe and Singapore were very high levels of patent activity. I focused on these three particular countries because they concurrently had moved up the economic development ladder at the same time, whereas some of those other patent tiger countries were already at fairly high levels of economic development. But it is not accidental that smaller countries that also have very high levels of investment in human and intellectual capital are especially reliant on the patent system. Why is that? Because they are in the position of supplying components to the larger global innovation economy. To fully monetize their R&D investments, they typically need to reach larger target markets.
Hmm.
So at the country level, they are almost in the position of a smaller firm, of a component supplier firm in any particular technology market. And this insight allows us to generalize from the patent tigers to the innovation economy in general. And as I've written elsewhere, there is theoretical reasons and there's empirical evidence to suggest that the class of firms that are most reliant on the patent system are firms that are smaller, that focus on R&D and supply components to larger systems. This goes back to Arrow's insight. They rely on patents to lower the transaction costs and enter into fair market negotiations with larger companies that maintain those larger platforms and systems. It also turns out that there's considerable evidence that it is precisely those smaller firms, R&D focused firms, that are often the sources of the most breakthrough level types of innovation that deliver the greatest level of social return. So the patent tigers are not a one-off case. They're really an application of this economics of innovation, economics of the patent system that applies generally across many different types of innovation ecosystems.
And applying the same general economic insight that Adam Smith recognized that you detailed earlier in providing components as opposed to trying to be the sole provider of the entire manufacturing inputs and supply chain inputs in total. They are embracing the value enhancing aspects of the specialization division of labor.
Absolutely. In a way, I'm proud to say that this idea is not new. this idea is the division of labor, which is uncontroversially viewed as a source of economic growth that grows the pie for everyone. But what I think is important to emphasize, it allows for a pathway into the market for firms that are rich in ideas, but they are poor in capital. And we can see this over and over. We see it in the late 20th century, early 21st century semiconductor market. And it would exceed our time, but maybe on another session we could talk about the late 19th century railroad market. And I can tell we can tell similar stories with different technologies.
Well, as you know me, as a historian, I'd love to talk about the 19th century. Would be here all day. This is a fascinating. So you did say, that the category of patent tigers should be expanded. Are there other countries that are scoring surprisingly high in their patenting rates?
Yeah, there do seem to be a handful of countries, as I said, as Singapore should be added to the list, Sweden, Switzerland, and a handful of other European countries that have this combination of small domestic markets. They have invested heavily in R&D, invested heavily in STEM education, and they seem to rely on the patent system in order to monetize those investments.
All right. Oh, great. And so there's more research and more work to be done. But I do want to
Absolutely,
note that
there
I think
always
that's
is.
but this is the first time that I think an academic has ever happily said, my insight is not new. Although I do think you do have importantly new insights here, and I'm very happy that you're sharing them with us today. Now, I just want to ask one more quick follow-up on specifically on the patent tigers that you did look at, and about their country level systems, ecosystems. So going down to the level of individual firms or specific industries, I think you've touched on this a little bit already, but I want to make it a little clearer and really hammer on this point. Can we learn more about the role of patents in these countries or in innovation economies and ecosystems more generally?
Yeah, so when we drill down into the innovation ecosystems and want to know which type of firms in Taiwan, which type of firms in Israel seem to be using the patent system the most, that what we find there is actually consistent with these theoretical framework that I've been laying out. And let me give you an example. So the number one patentee, and I'm talking about, of course, the US patent system, is a company called Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, known as TSMC. Okay, and I talked a little bit before about how the wonders of the smartphone and actually how relatively cheap those are in historical terms. And one company to thank for that is TSMC, who has led innovation in process technologies and wafer production has been critical in miniaturizing these very powerful computing devices. Now, why does patents matter to TSMC? Okay, well, and here's why, and I'm going to put this together now with another type of firm that is reliant on the patent system, which are firms that design chips for your smartphone or for other devices, but they have no downstream production or distribution capacities. The patent system allows the combination of these two firms, firms that specialize in chip design, located at the very top of this innovation supply chain, and firms like TSMC that specialize in process innovation. Okay. This is an amazing plus from a competition policy perspective. The chip design firm lacks the resources and the technical capacities to produce the chip. TSMC, however, has precisely that capital and those capacities. Patents mediate the exchange of information, very valuable and costly information. The chip design asset being exposed, being disclosed by the chip design firm to TSMC, and TSMC in turn working together with the engineers from the chip design firm are disclosing their process technologies. All of this now takes place within a secure property rights infrastructure. Why is this a great thing from a competition policy perspective? Well, before the market discovered that you could put together firms that specialize in chip design with firms that specialize in chip production, in order to compete into this market, you had to do both of those things. There's only a couple firms that still do that today because it's so enormously expensive to construct and operate and maintain a fabrication facility. Patents have enabled the semiconductor industry or certain segments of it to break apart into these specialized suppliers. Patents mediate the relationships around them, and it enables specifically chip design firms to enter into the market and detour around this massive capital requirements that would have otherwise obstructed entry into the market. And so that's what's happening in Taiwan, in particular, where we drill down into their ecosystem. We see a very important role being played, both for the part of the Taiwanese chip production firms and the chip design firms, both in Taiwan and other countries that are their customers. And this all ultimately trickles down and redounds to the benefit of the consumer in the US and in other markets.
So what you're finding again and again and again is a repeat of this story of this important correlation that keeps being identified, which is idea-rich, capital poor, in terms of resources, benefiting from these disaggregated supply chains by being able to rely upon reliable and effective property rights, and therefore participating in contributing their ideas and benefiting from other people who are more heavily capitalized, and thus achieving overall efficiencies, and thus reducing consumer prices and maximizing output.
Absolutely, I couldn't put it better. And I think it's helpful to maybe take this point for a second, just step back for a second and appreciate why it matters in the broader policy debate over patents beyond international development, economic growth. I think it's fair to say much of that policy debate has focused on the social bads, the social costs of the patent system, the litigation, the licensing negotiation costs. And it's undoubtedly the case that as you roll out or as you increase the usage of a formal property rights system, you're going to get more litigation, right? But all of that has to be balanced against all of the social goods, all of the social gains that you get from a formal property rights system. Now, much of the debate, including defenders of the patent system, have focused on the classic relationship between innovation incentives and strong property rights. What the findings in this paper suggest is while there is that relationship, there's another social gain, another economic gain that is distinguishable, and that is this reduction of transaction costs that we can attribute to secure patent rights, lowering the cost of transacting over information, lowering the cost of entering into the market, and allowing the market to discover the most efficient way to take an innovation, produce it, cut up the supply chain into the most efficient way possible. And that brings us back to, I think, what was maybe one of your first questions. Why should the US consumer care about this? The US consumer should care about this because this is part of the reason why we have this massive computing and communications power in a device that fits into the palm of our hand.
Yeah, amazing. And so to tie it back a little bit as we come close to the conclusion of our discussion here, our current pandemic and the concerns about pharmaceuticals and innovation in the medical care for the treatment of things like COVID-19 and related medical conditions, right? One often hears the point that you just mentioned, right? That patents are a blockade. Sometimes the phrase is used that they're a quote tax unquote on innovation, and so. How does your research speak to this? Because right now we've been speaking mostly, I think, entirely in the context of the high tech industry. So what does your research have any implications for the biopharmaceutical sector as well?
Totally. And you know, what is remarkable is that the way the market reacts, the way the market reorganizes supply chains in the IT sector, we see the market doing the same thing in the biotech life sciences sector. So what happens in the biotech life sciences sector is that where we have secure property rights over life sciences and biotech innovations and biotech research tools, right? When patent protection started being extended into this market, precisely the arguments you were just described were made, that this would create transaction costs, it would create a litigation cloud, and it would block innovation, and the patent system would discourage rather than encouraging innovation. Okay. And as I just said at the beginning of our conversation, I like to let the world and the numbers and the market's performance tell the story. So when we look at the biotech and the life sciences market, since patent protection has been increased starting in the early 80s, what we see is a massive entry into the market of small scientist-founded biotech firms that are rich in ideas, but they are poor in capital. We see almost universally the business model used by these firms, including firms that are active in the development of vaccines and other therapies in the current crisis, which we very much hope that they will be successful and do so quickly in being successful. We see them relying on a patent-based business model. Why do we see that universally? Well, Arrow's information paradox explains why. They rely on the patent to interact with venture capitalists that fund the earlier stages of development, and they rely on the patent in order to enter into negotiations with big pharma, who are essential to do the heavy lifting. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in costs in testing and production to take an innovation and move it down the timeline into the hands of medical providers and ultimately patients. So yeah, we see a remarkably similar economic logic playing out in the function of patents and reducing transaction costs, reducing entry barriers, whether we're looking at the IT market or whether we're looking at a life sciences market.
Wow. So whether we're talking about pins or railroads or semiconductor chips or smartphones or the latest biotech and pharmaceutical innovations and diagnostic testing or vaccines, the story remains the same. Wow, fascinating.
The story remains the same, and the fact that we see these theoretical intuitions being confirmed over and over, following the natural path of scientific inquiry, I think we can start to increase our level of confidence that, in fact, there is a strong relationship between secure intellectual property rights, patents in particular, and innovation and economic growth on the other hand.
Well, it's clearly very important insights, not just for international relations and our policies with respect to developing countries, but also with respect to our policies that impact both biopharmaceutical innovation and high-tech innovation. One normally does not see studies that bridge all of those different silos of activity that people are usually engaged in. So quite novel and quite important at the end of the day. Well, thank you, Jonathan. This has been a fascinating conversation. I hope our audience has enjoyed it as well. I direct people, if you were interested in seeing the details of his original study, which was published in 2017 in the Criterion Journal on Innovation, and then certainly you should check out his update to his earlier study that was published in 2020 in the winter spring 2019-2020 issue of Regulation magazine. So thank you again, Jonathan, and I hope everyone has enjoyed our discussion today.
Thank you, Adam. I certainly enjoyed it myself.